So some people have wondered about what clear task parameters look like when you're not reading a traditional printed text with like sentences and paragraphs, paragraphs and pages in sort of a book format. So we can do clear task parameters for any text, anything that is a bunch of symbols that carry meaning that someone has to look at and make sense of altogether, whether it's on a page or whether it's an object or whether it's the relationship between objects in a given area. So if we were looking at a data table, the challenge with data tables is that you can look at them a bazillion ways. Like looking at this data table, you can come up with a lot of different information. You can think about who won the war. You can think about the kinds of casualties there were. You can think about the kinds of things that we measure when we measure casualties. You could probably tell a bunch of different stories from this relatively small set of data. And because there are so many possibilities, students really need to be told what they're using this data for, and then also how they should be looking at the table in order to extract that purpose from it. So for example, above my head, we have look at this chart. So it doesn't have to be read this in order to. It could be take a look at the chart in order to. The reason that we're doing that is to figure out the impact of disease on the Civil War. And the way that I want you to do that is I want you to take a look at the difference between the number of people that died of wounds versus the number of people that died of disease. And you could even go as far as say, I want you to do that by picturing in your head the difference between 249,000 and 110,000. Or I want you to divide the number that died of disease by the number that died of wounds and see which one's bigger and how much bigger. Those are things that we would do sort of naturally when we look at a data table. If we knew our purpose was to figure out the impact of disease, we would go looking for that disease row and start comparing it. Well, students don't necessarily know that that's exactly what they should do, that the efficient thing to do is find the disease row and compare it to the rows around it. So we tell them explicitly, if your purpose is to figure out the role of disease, then you first find that row that talks about disease and you start to compare it to the one that talks about any other reasons that people might die. It's more important in some ways to do clear task parameters when the text is not a traditional text, when it is a text feature or a visual representation of information rather than a narrative of it, because there's so many ways that you could look at the data table. It also might feel even more natural. So you might find that you have a really easy time with clear task parameters when you're looking at a data representation and a harder time when you're doing text, or vice versa. But I encourage you to play around with both and see what happens for your students when you do it in both cases.